I'm so excited because we get to dive deep into a topic I'm passionate about, which is the gut microbiome. And this is clearly, literally one of the most important steps you can take to improve your health. And I'm not talking with myself, I'm talking with an expert. And believe me, there are 99% of GI experts I would not talk to because they don't know what they need to, but the dangerous part is they think they do. But not Dr. Pedre. He is great. We had such a wonderful time, and we dived really far into the complexities of exactly how you modulate and the steps that you need to take and be concerned about. And if you don't, you're going to run into problems. And there's some really valuable information here you're going to obtain. So I can't wait for you to watch it.
The gut is the foundation for everything. The goal is not to have only non-pathogenic bacteria, good bacteria. There is about, in a healthy gut, about 10 to 15% of the bacteria are quote unquote pathogenic. I think if anything, they serve as a hormetic stressor for the non-pathogenic bacteria in order to keep the entire ecosystem in balance. One thing that we know that microplastics do, they disrupt the gut microbiome, so they cause dysbiosis, and they lead to disruptions in the mucus layer. So yet another thing to throw in the picture of what's harming our guts. So you have to kind of be able to find all of the unturned stones, is what I tell people, and then work on rebalancing the body.
Welcome, everyone. Dr. Mercola helping you take control of your health. And we're going to talk about your gut today, one of my favorite topics. And we're going to talk about with Dr. Vincent Pedre, who is an internist and has focused on this area for quite some time now. And he's really studied functional medicine. So he's brought his expertise to this area. And this is one of my passions, too. I've got a new book out called Your Guide to Cellular Health. And for the most part, I think anyone who's interested in natural healing and health acknowledges that the gut is part of the problem. It would be very unusual, if not almost impossible, to find someone who doesn't agree with that statement. But here's the key: is that most people, physicians specifically, don't appreciate just how much it is. It really is, in my view, it's almost the core of all disease. But there's many complexities that lead to that dysfunction. That's what I want to dive in deep today, because there's not that many people who understand this well. So I am so excited that we're connecting, and thank you for joining us today.
I'm so excited to be here. It's such an honor to have this conversation with you, Dr. Mercola.
All right. Well, likewise. So, what maybe you can share your journey and how you got to this space and what motivated you to acquire this expertise and how you position it. I've listened to a few of your podcasts, and it sounds like the majority of your focus is on the gut, which is what I was looking for. I really was looking to identify some of the leading experts because the the gut is such an important part of my new understanding and recommendations. So that's why I really want to dive in and discuss it.
I love that, and thank you. Um, God, I'm going to try to make a long story short because there's actually more than one story weaved into my origin story of how I ended up where I'm at. Probably the best place to start is having had a very sensitive stomach as a child. I remember having lots of upset stomachs, constipation. Now you have to understand, like, I was raised by Cuban immigrants, and the way we ate was kind of influenced by the marketing and big food of the 1970s, 80s. So I was waking up and eating a sugary cereal for breakfast with milk, lots of bread, pasta, not a lot of salads. I didn't grow up. I really remember one night I got punished by my dad because I refused to eat the salad at the dinner table, and he sent me to my room without dinner. And later that night, my mom and my grandmother snuck a bowl of ice cream to my room. So I didn't grow up eating the healthiest diet, but I think what really knocked off my gut health and caused a slew of problems that I think really made me passionate about this is that probably around, let's say, the age of 10, I started getting throat infections, sinus infections, and my mom would take me to the pediatrician and I would get a round of antibiotics. And then a few months later, I was sick again. I would get another round of antibiotics. And I started thinking back and realizing that antibiotics were so normalized in the 1980s as the solution for any sore throat, sinus pressure, chest congestion, that I was probably on 2 to 3 rounds of antibiotics per year. And by the time I was 19 years old, I had been on 20 plus rounds of antibiotics, some of which included Cipro, which is a fluoroquinolone, which we now know takes 12 months for the gut to recover from just a 5-day course of Cipro. And if you look at what happens to the gut after each antibiotic course, you can never recover back to baseline. It's nearly impossible. And I was on 20 plus rounds of antibiotics, had gone through this growth spurt, became super thin, and I couldn't gain weight. Now, the two biggest food groups in my diet were wheat and dairy. So, like I said, I was eating sugary cereals for breakfast. And I should probably add the third biggest one was sugar. I was constantly eating sweets. Calculated that I probably ate like 3,000 to 4,000 calories a day. And I was rail thin. I could not gain any weight. And my biggest concern in my teenage years when I became a bit of a hypochondriac was, how do I not get sick? So my parents would take me to the pediatrician and they said, oh, you're not eating enough. You're not eating enough of the right foods, or you need to be on a multivitamin. So they gave me a prescription multivitamin. You probably remember those multis from back in the 80s that were like these horse pills that were packed down synthetic, non-bioavailable vitamins that I just would take and then smell it being peed out in my urine. And none of that made me healthier. So part of my motivation for becoming a doctor was to really understand the immune system and where all of this was coming from. And yet in medical school, nobody taught us the importance of the gut as the foundation
Sure.
for all of that. Now, I have to say that my dad was very concerned about immune response and food. And I remember he did a food allergy testing back in his
Your dad
50s.
was a physician?
My dad was an engineer, very
Oh,
analytical, not a doctor. I'm the only doctor in my family.
mm,
And um, he did food allergy testing back in the 80s and then had a whole
mm,
list of foods that he shouldn't eat. So even though there was a discrepancy between how we as
mm.
kids were eating and living our life, there was this influx of information from my dad. Took all these supplements and was always learning about what, taking raw garlic when he was sick. And I remember doing the same thing, chewing on garlic when I felt like I had a sore throat. So there was already some of that in my upbringing. So I already thought that food has something to do with it, even though I wasn't learning that in medical school.
Yeah.
And then quickly weaved into this story was, and I'm going to just be super fast on it.
Yeah, because we want to get in the details. We don't want to go that we don't need a lot more of the history, just kind of maybe summarize it so we can
Yeah,
go into.
just a very quick. Before I started medical school, I had this fear of needles, and I was really concerned that I could not become a doctor because of that. And I started researching what happened to my body when I reacted to needles, the parasympathetic, sympathetic, the autonomic nervous system. And that led me down this rabbit hole of learning about breath work, meditation, started doing yoga, reading Dr. Weil, Dr. Deepak Chopra. And I did that for 8 months before I got to medical school. So by the time I got to medical school, my mind was open to these possibilities that were outside of mainstream medicine.
Yeah.
And I think that, along with my search for what I call the truth, is what really influenced me to go down the path of functional medicine.
Okay. And do you focus primarily on the gut in functional medicine, or do you do a more comprehensive approach? Because you're trained as an internist.
I'm trained as an internist, so I always bring that general, like, broad understanding. But the types of patients that I get are usually coming to me because of some sort of gut health issue. But as you know, Dr. Mercola, nobody just has a gut issue.
Mhm.
They have gut and brain, gut and skin, gut immune system, gut metabolic. The gut is the foundation for everything. So even as a gut health expert, what I tell people is that I look at the body through the lens of the gut. I put on my gut glasses, and I look at the body through the angle of gut health, but I still look at the person holistically.
Okay. So I wanted to comment on your history, um, which is not abnormal. That was actually normal. That's what you describe as what almost everyone in this country does, and certainly what I did, because it's the rare, I would say under 5%, maybe is, well, now it might be a bit higher, but probably closer to 1% at the time you're describing of people who understood health at the level to make wise choices because of the massive brainwashing and propaganda. So that's not unusual, but I had a similar journey, and as a result, my gut wasn't impacted as much. But I think it may be because I probably grew up a little bit earlier than you did, and there wasn't this, and the antibiotics were not as cephalosporins didn't exist when I was a child, so I never got those. And the only ones we had was like penicillin. I don't even think amoxicillin exists. It was just simple penicillin. So that was the worst. And if you're going to use an antibiotic, it's probably one of the most benign. So I didn't have the assault on my microbiome. And of course, in your work, you recognize that the antibiotics are a leading contributor to that.
Mhm.
But I think there's other deeper ones. And that's one of the ones I was impressed with your work. And the deeper ones would be there's not many clinicians. Again, most people understand that processed foods are a problem. And even you have kind of implied in your comment that you had a lot of sugar. But I'm of the belief that the sugar by itself isn't a problem. In fact, maybe uh, I'm going to propose to you later in the conversation that it may be part of a therapeutic remedy to resolve what's going on in a very specific way. But normally, when people say that they've had sugar in processed foods, it's the linoleic acid, the omega 6 polyunsaturated fats that are embedded and meshed with that sugar. Almost always. It's very rare we're eating sugars like jelly beans or gummy bears or something. It's just usually enmeshed with these pernicious fats. So I think that would probably be more of an issue. And that's one of the areas where I was intrigued with your work, because most people acknowledge that, like they acknowledge that the gut is an issue, but they don't really understand the details. And I think you understand it at a deeper level, that really it's more of a causal thing. Maybe on the level, and I propose in my book, one of the three primary factors that causes the gut dysfunction. It's the linoleic acids that's causal that results in that. And then once you got the gut dysfunction, for whatever reason, in your case, is the antibiotics and the other processed foods, but it just gets worse and worse and worse to the point where you essentially, well, I'll discuss that later, but I think you go into a spiraling black hole of death that almost everyone never escapes unless they address the foundational causes. And that's what I want to explore with you today, because I haven't had an opportunity to interact and dialogue with someone with your expertise to bounce these ideas off. So
Yeah.
you can respond to that one now.
I think there are many factors that um, add up to gut health issues, because the microbiome is a big part of it, right? The microbiome has more DNA than our body and encodes for a bunch of genes. And they even think that the human body could not function without some of the postbiotic products that are produced by our gut microbiome. But it's really interesting when we're talking about, like, what is a healthy microbiome? And and I think, just to dispel some myth around that, I think we have to understand that there isn't just one fingerprint of what a healthy microbiome is. There are many different potentially healthy microbiomes, that depend on where you live on the planet, what types of foods are endemic to those regions, what you tend to eat. And we know this from looking at blue zones and looking at people who live to 100, that the microbiome of people who live longer tend to have the ability to fight off inflammation more effectively than the microbiome of somebody who's 80 years old and is on 5 to 10 different medications and has cardiovascular disease, diabetes, overweight, all those things. But one thing that and I think also on the other side of that is the gut lining. The health of the gut lining is
They're
critical, is
and they're
absolutely
connected, and they're
critical.
connected, and
And
they're
they're,
connected.
yeah, they're symbiotic, and they're connected. One thing that was really fascinating for me when I was researching my last book, The Gut Smart Protocol, was I got a chance to go to Africa. And I went and spent 3 days, 2 nights with the Hadza, the hunter-gatherers, one of the last hunter-gatherer groups on the planet. Been living this way for thousands of years, but if you look at human history, which probably goes back 30,000, maybe 50,000 years ago, we've been hunter-gatherers more for our history than we have been domesticating plants and growing agriculture. And so what was really fascinating to me about them is that they looked at their gut microbiome, their own unique signature. Now, that in itself would be fascinating, but I think the more important thing is that they're not expressing any of the Western diseases. They don't get diabetes, they don't get heart disease, they don't get dementia, they don't get obesity. So
And they don't get linoleic acid in excess or
they're not,
processed foods.
they're mostly eating. So their diet, because in functional medicine, if you look at the functional medicine world, they're saying, eat the rainbow, eat all different colors.
No, no,
And the truth is, like, you look at the Hadza, they're not eating a very wide color
no.
palette. They're eating
Right.
animals, they're hunting, they're eating wild blueberries, or I'm sorry, wild berries, which the berries in the brush, they are actually very muted in color. They almost look brownish, like they don't have
Mhm.
those bright colors that we're used to. They're eating baobab fruit, which is super high in fiber. They're getting wild honey. I went hunting and foraging with them. We found these wild honeybees in Africa that look like flies. They're super tiny. Now they're eating everything. They're eating the honey, the honeycomb, the bees. When I was with them, they just had me put my hands out and they poured out like it was honeycomb, little bees trapped in there that looked like flies. And of course, I had it. But that's building their immune system. There's like over 200 bioactive peptides in honey. And then they're eating tubers. So they're digging tubers out of the ground. Their diet is not the rainbow. And yet they have an incredibly diverse gut microbiome. And I think part of it is that they haven't been exposed to antibiotics, but also they are exposed to dirt. They're exposed to nature. And I think we can't discount the importance of the microbiome that we get exposed to by being out in nature, by putting our
Sure.
hands in the dirt, by having contact with the natural world. Because I really started thinking about that. I'm like, why did in functional medicine do we always say eat the rainbow, and yet the Hadza have a more diverse gut microbiome and less disease than Westerners?
Well, I think I have an answer to that, and I want to explore that because
Yeah.
I think I understand why the answer to that. So, but let's pivot back to the diversity and attempt to identify or discriminate between two types of gut bacteria: simply good bacteria, beneficial bacteria, and pathogenic or disease causing.
Yeah.
And because interestingly, the antibiotics should kill both, but when they do cause that to happen, it seems that sets off a series of events that essentially results in gut catastrophe.
Yes.
And I think I understand why, but I want to run through it with you. So the two bacteria concentration. And most of these bacteria that we're talking about, they're in the intestine, like 97, 99% of it. That's where almost all your bacteria reside in your large
Yeah, in
intestine,
your
the
large
colon.
intestine.
Yeah. So this is where these guys predominate. So in that colon, you've got the bad guys, which are also another name for the bad guys, pathogenic bacteria, would be facultative anaerobes, meaning that they tolerate oxygen. And the good guys, the beneficials, are obligate anaerobes. That means oxygen is a poison. They die at the
Hmm.
slightest hint of oxygen. And well, that's odd. Oxygen is supposed to help you with these, not these bacteria. These bacteria were from primordial Earth. And this, when the Earth didn't have oxygen, these are layovers from that. And the normal oxygen tension in a healthy person is like less than 0.1% in the lumen. Less than 0.1% oxygen. Normally it's 20% in the atmosphere, 21%. So I think that's where it all comes from. And is when you are introduced to mitochondrial poisons, clearly which antibiotics are, not a common one, but enough to cause this cacophony of ill of poisons that essentially decimate your mitochondria. And I think the crux of all of this, yes, is the gut microbiome, but ultimately it's the ability of your body to generate cellular energy.
Hmm.
And that's done primarily in the mitochondria, certainly it's done in glycolysis, but it's primarily in mitochondria. And when
Which,
your mitochondria start to fail, yeah, go ahead.
well, what I was going to say is that mitochondria historically were bacteria,
Bacteria. Yeah, they're
right?
symbiotic. They
That
emerged
were
in,
that were brought into uh, these mammalian cells and then started producing energy, and we created this symbiotic
yeah,
relationship.
these are more recent bacteria, though, more than likely because they actually thrive with oxygen. That's what they do. They use oxygen to generate energy very efficiently, so much more efficiently that we're potentially, well, there are some authors like Nick Lane, who wrote Power, Sex, and Suicide, believe is 10,000 times more energy dense than the sun.
Wow.
That the energy density of the mitochondria. So the crux though is that we get these mitochondrial poisons, and there's cell. You brought up a really good point with the gut lining and the leaky gut. And the leaky gut is an indirect consequence of the bacterial. So they're not the direct cause, but indirect, because one of the purposes of that leaky, the gut, are the cells in the leaky, in that line they call it. One cell thick, that lining is only one cells, and it's a number of different cells, but colonocytes and goblet cells are the primary ones. And the colonocytes have mitochondria. And when you're introduced to mitochondrial poisons like linoleic acid, like microplastics or estrogens, then and also EMF, the mitochondria start to spiral downhill out of control and die, specifically in the colonocytes. And the colonocytes primarily, there are cells, different cells have different substrates that they I prefer.
Yeah.
So like the heart cells would be primarily fatty acids, but the
Yeah.
colonicytes are also primarily
MCTs.
fatty acids. Yeah,
Yeah.
they're
And
beta, beta oxidation. That's what
yeah,
they do.
the colon
And
cells require butyrate, which we're not
right,
producing. It's being produced by butyrate producing bacteria in the gut.
right. Well,
Thus,
I'm getting there. I'm getting there. So those cells, you're right. They make the short chain fatty acids, and at least some of them do. The good bacteria do. The beneficials, the pathogenic don't.
no.
They don't. So that's another differential for them for sure. But so when you got the mitochondrial poisons, then when the colonocytes start to die, as they do with the mitochondrial poisons, then you develop the leaky gut. The holes start to appear, and guess what happens? In addition to the proteins from the food going back in, you've got oxygen leaking in from the abdominal cavity into the colon, and it's that increased oxygen concentration in the colon that differentially decimates the beneficial bacteria. And nature abhors a vacuum, right? So the pathogenic bacteria come in, and then it's off to the
Take
races,
over.
and you get this vicious cycle that you can never escape unless you somehow figure out how to restore the health of those colonocytes. And I have not seen anyone figure that out yet, because it's and that's why. And I really, this is I'm not trying to lecture. I want you to know what the understanding, so
Love
we can
this.
dialogue about this, and there
Yeah.
was some basic information I had to share. So, and if you, the strategy is to get those colonocytes back to health and lower that oxygen tension, because you can have the best supplements in the world, best probiotics. They don't work for a number of reasons. If one, they don't survive the journey, because an obligate anaerobe,
Mm.
if it's released from the capsule prematurely, it will die in the small intestine. It will absolutely die. It will never reach your colon to implant. But even if it makes it magically to the colon, if there's high oxygen tension there, it will not survive and thrive. It will die. It's like trying to grow apple trees in the Sahara Desert. It doesn't work too well. You got to have the right environment, right? So anyway, that's the crux of the issue. You got exposed to the mitochondrial poisons, you get the oxygen tension buildup, and you have this differential focus that essentially causes those pathogenic bacteria to multiply and explode, and literally
Everybody.
get out. And here's the thing: the final part of it is, when you're healthy, if you've got a great microbiome like the Hadza, they have a limited diet, but they could eat those healthy rainbow color foods and probably be really fine with it, because their colonocytes are intact and they have the capacity to digest those fibers. The pathogenic bacteria do not have the capacity. If you give them the fiber foods, the high fiber foods that's normally considered healthy, and this is sort of a paradox of sorts, most people will do worse. They will get worse. They get worse on a high fiber diet.
Yeah.
When if they were healthy, that's the best thing to improve. And even like the worst fibers would be the fructooligosaccharides, the
Yeah.
inulin. And I remember
I find that people with gut health issues,
that will destroy them.
a lot of times, what I've been doing now with patients, and I have some comments on a couple of the things that you said there. So
Oh,
I
I
think
guess
it's
what I'm looking for. Yeah, yeah.
um, I've actually been using a lot of more carnivore-like diet in patients who come in with severe gut issues to help them start to re-heal the gut. And I find that you have to take out a very vegetable laden, lectin laden diet, because it's just really difficult on the gut. And I've been having amazing results using carnivore or carnivore like diet.
Or low carb would be
Yeah,
the generic.
very
Under
low,
50 grams of
yeah,
carbs.
very low carb diet. I do want to say something about the pathogenic versus the non-pathogenic.
Yes.
The way that I look at the gut ecosystem, I think the goal is not to have only non-pathogenic bacteria, good bacteria. There is about, in a healthy gut, about 10 to 15% of the bacteria are quote unquote pathogenic. I kind of think of it like the Amazon rainforest. We've got all types of different animals, insects in that ecosystem. And some of them are, we would call pathogens, like a panther. They're predators. And yet somehow by being there, they keep the ecosystem in balance. And I think that's the same thing. I think there is yet to be understood role of these pathogenic bacteria.
Yes, I agree.
And I think if
Yeah.
anything, they serve as a hormetic stressor for the non-pathogenic bacteria to keep them um, having to
Well,
do the work that they do in order to keep the entire ecosystem in balance.
no, I couldn't agree more. That's why C. diff, real common cause of death, and when it gets in excess, septic shock,
And I want
which
to
is,
add, sorry, a
yeah,
little tidbit there. People who take PPIs are at higher risk. So proton pump inhibitors, medications that block stomach acid, which are so incorrectly prescribed by gastroenterologists and doctors, increase the risk of developing C. diff.
of course, yeah. But C. diff, to your point, earlier point, C. diff can be very beneficial to your gut flora, for sure, no question. It doesn't mean you should never have it. There's no way, but it has to be in the right
And
balance.
there
Another
are
word you used.
actually clostridial species that are butyrate
Yes.
producers that are
Oh, those are
important
some of the
to
most.
the gut.
I've done deep research. I'm funding a very large project now to identify the ideal, most beneficial obligate anaerobes, and we have the initial list of about 20, and there's 3 or 4 strains of C. diff in the top 10. No question.
Yeah.
Not C. diff, Clostridia. It's Clostridia. They're not
Clostridia.
there.
Yeah. Not C.
Yeah,
diff, but
Clostridia. Yeah,
Clostridia
but Clostridia, because you're
at
right.
genus.
They make a lot of butyrate. They're very beneficial. There's no question. But these
Yeah.
are obligate anaerobes. These are not, so they're in the right context, they're phenomenal. So I wanted to address what you've stumbled upon with the carnivore and low carb. It does work. There's no question. But I would challenge you to extend that going forward. It'll work a month, 2 months, 3 months, maybe even a year. But if you're really careful and follow the patients, they'll start to biologically deteriorate. The
Yeah.
reason they do better is because you're not feeding those pathogenic bacteria. They
Yeah.
have no fuel. They can't survive.
Yeah.
So they die off in this.
Or yeast also, because a
Oh, yes,
lot of
yes,
people
yes.
have,
Pathogens,
yeah, pathogens.
bacteria, viruses, bacteriophages. There's
Exactly.
yeast, fungi, the whole thing. It's the whole terrain. So, but anyway, that whole system gets deprived of its fuel, and the biggest one I think is the endotoxins from the pathogenic bacteria. And the other thing about this too, why do you feed the beneficial bacteria and you don't get those symptoms? Because I think all the gram negatives make lipopolysaccharide (LPS), which can activate
Yeah.
TLR4 cell, the
Well, like
receptor.
receptor 4.
But the problem is, and I'm confident, I think I've reviewed a few studies on it or papers, but I don't think that the endotoxin produced from pathogenic bacteria is well, I don't, from non-pathogenic bacteria, beneficial, is as nowhere near as virulent as that one from the pathogenic bacteria. So they have a more toxic endotoxin.
Hmm.
I don't know. I think why, Bill? Well, because they don't have as many metabolic resources. They can't use oxygen as a fuel where the pathogenic bacteria can. So they have more fuel and resources. They can make a more dangerous toxin.
I want to say something on the pathogenic versus non-pathogenic, because I think it also, at least from looking at the Hadza and the studies that they've done on their microbiome, it looks like it also depends on the context.
Mm-hmm.
So the Hadza have high levels of treponema in their gut, which, if you put the same bacteria in a human, treponema is the bacteria that causes syphilis. It is a pathogen. It is not a friendly bacteria. And yet, in the Hadza, you see highest levels of treponema in the women versus the men, but it's present. And the reason it's present is that treponema is incredibly efficient at breaking down cellular cellulose, so plant fibers. And because they have such a high fiber diet, especially the women eat more root vegetables, whereas the men are going to probably eat a bit more meat from hunted animals and then some of the root vegetables. But I thought that was fascinating that even in a certain context, a bacteria that could be bad might not be
Yeah.
bad.
Yeah, it all goes most to the context, right? What is the surrounding microbiome
Yeah.
that supports or inhibits or establishes an equilibrium that results in biological harmony? So
Yeah.
that's not surprising at all. But I want to get back to the carnivore low carb approach. The danger that many people, I certainly didn't appreciate until relatively recently, before I wrote this book, I did. That's why I wrote this book to include this material, is that there is a danger for low carb. It's a mess. I wrote a book that was the #1 bestseller in the entire country, Fat for Fuel. Okay, so I am no stranger to low carb diets, but
Yeah.
I've since abandoned that for the reason I'm about to
I
share. And
think
that
I
when you
agree with you. I'm in the same page that I think
okay,
it's an induction diet to get
yeah,
somebody past the sticking point. Then
right.
you have to graduate that diet over time.
Okay, good. So we're in agreement. So because if you don't, then you probably understand that you elevate cortisol levels and you start to decimate your muscle mass because you got to have fuel to make carbohydrates, and if you don't have carbohydrates, you're going to die. It's as simple as that. I mean, so when your body makes it, it doesn't go to the gut; it goes into the blood. So that's why you don't have the problem. But you're still there's a massive price to pay when you make them yourself. So I think this is the key. So we're both in agreement. Low carb diet works,
Yeah.
but there's consequences. You don't want to do it long term. It's this transition. So this is I think the next interesting phase where I think sugar can be highly beneficial in that transition. And I'll tell you why. Because almost all these other carbs are going to activate endotoxin release from the pathogens. The excessive. And when I say that, it's sort of a short. I understand it's an excessive pathogen. In the right context, pathogenic bacteria are not pathogens. I get that. I understand. I'm not
Exactly.
in disagreement. 100%.
Yeah.
No disagreement. I just try to simplify it for brevity of explaining it. But yeah, it's all about excess. So you've got these excess, it's fueling them, and they're. I think it's one of the biggest causes of death is people are dying from what I term mitochondrial shock or mitoshock, which is a more accurate term than septic shock, which is release of endotoxin. The endotoxin's there because you have mitochondrial dysfunction, and you're and it just you essentially go into massive mitochondrial shock. Everything shuts down, and it's even if it's septic shock, and it's not listed as a cause of death, but if you look in the what people are dying from, it's 300,000 people a year are acknowledged to die from septic shock. 300,000. I mean,
Oh.
that's right up there in the top view, right? Right up there. But if you go into more details of who's dying from heart attacks, who's dying from stroke or diabetic complications, so there's almost always septic
I
shock
mean,
involved.
septic shock is an extreme form of leaky gut
Yeah,
where even the blood vessels become leaky. Your body just becomes just this
yeah.
completely inflamed, out of control. Uh,
Yeah, and many people die from it. It's not widely known, but because it's not recognized as a normal cause of death because there's so many metabolic factors that go into it that it's not classified
we
like a
saw
heart
it a
attack
lot
or
in
a stroke.
in the hospital in the intensive care
Yeah,
unit. That was
yeah,
probably the main
it's
cause of death for
pervasive.
everybody in the intensive care
Yeah,
units.
that's right, and it's the I offer that it's the main cause of death for almost everyone because it's all due to the defective mitochondria, the damaged mitochondria, not defective. They are healthy, and the beautiful thing is that if you understand how to decipher this, you can recover almost anyone from any disease. I firmly believe that, unless you get too far down and you're on your deathbed, then you have to have some reserve to recover. But assuming you have a reserve, if you implement the right protocols, I believe almost every disease can be reversed.
It
I didn't
depends
believe
on
that
where you get
before.
the person in the line,
Yeah,
but I mean, it took me until my 30s to figure out that my gut microbiome had been decimated in my teenage years, and that I was had developed a sensitivity to wheat. I have non celiac gluten sensitivity, and I also had a sensitivity to dairy and some other foods. I've been able to bring back some dairy since then, but it took me 2 decades to figure out how destroyed my gut microbiome had been. And then I started doing restoration and incorporating probiotics, fermented foods, changing the diet, organic, like healthy meat, and I was able to reverse that in just really the way I felt. Um, as soon as I got rid of wheat, within 2 weeks, my mind turned back on. Like I had this brightness in my brain that I didn't realize. Like a lot of people, because our eating patterns are so normalized, that I was having maybe a slice of pizza for lunch, or maybe I would go out and get a sandwich. And then at 3 or 4 p.m., I felt like somebody had drugged me, and I just was struggling to get through the patient day because my eyes felt like they had weights on them, and I just wanted to shut down. The minute I got rid of wheat, no more fatigue, no more that shutting down of the brain in the afternoon.
well,
But
you're
within
preaching to the choir. For me, my first best-selling book was 20 years ago, and it was a no-grain diet. Yes.
took me a while to figure that out. But
Yeah.
within 6 months, I felt amazing. I felt
Yeah.
absolutely amazing and had figured out that you don't have to live with this for the rest of your life. And that's what made me so
No.
passionate about gut health and treating patients with gut health issues.
So maybe we should explore somewhat the metrics you're using to quantify restoration of gut health. But before we do that, I wanted to get the final piece of this, in that the somewhat ironic proposal that sugar can actually be beneficial. In fact,
I'm
I'm convinced of
curious
this.
what your point
I,
is
I,
there. I want to hear this.
oh yes, one of my books, and maybe I'll write it next year, is The Sugar Cure.
Okay.
Okay, so we've established the concept that carbohydrates in someone who has a damaged microbiome is highly counterproductive, and you can tolerate it, but eventually it gets worse and worse and worse. But
Yeah.
to the point that they're going to see someone like you. So the solution is to cut out the carbohydrates, but then you have to get back and put something back in. Well, sometimes it gets so far there's not much you can put back in because and we've also established that you have to have carbs. So you're between a rock and a hard place. So what's the solution? Well, the solution is to get there are several. The medical conventional solution is actually something they've been doing all along. And I never realized that you've been in the hospital. You're an internist. That's why I chose not to be an internist. I chose to be a family practice because I did not want to spend a lot of time in the ICU. I do not like the
I don't
ICU.
blame you.
Yeah, I do not like it. So anyway, but you saw many people on those bags. And what's in that bag? What sugar is in that bag?
Dextrose.
Dextrose, which for those who don't know, has another name. It's called glucose, which I propose, or not propose, I mean, Ray Pete is the one who helped us figure this out, but is the ideal mitochondrial fuel. The ideal, much better than fats because it burns the cleanest. So and actually that they're doing magnificent jobs by giving people IV dextrose. Why? Because they're getting sugar into their blood, not their gut, not their gut. There's no endotoxin release from that dextrose, none, zero, nada. So you can, but it's pretty difficult to go and get an IV all the time. That's less than ideal. But you can replicate that you can buy dextrose. You could also use sucrose, which is table sugar, which is a disaccharide of glucose and fructose. But dextrose by itself is better, it's cleaner. Fructose has some metabolic complications. But if you just get pure dextrose, you can buy about $5 a pound, most anywhere. I would get the non-GMO, so there's no glyphosate in there.
Yeah, exactly. Because you want to because it's derived from corn, so you want to make sure you're not getting genetically modified.
Yeah, well, I'm not too concerned about the GMOs. I'm concerned more about the glyphosate.
Yeah, the glyphosate
would be concerned about that. That's another gut toxin. Oh my gosh, hits the shikimate pathway, destroys the gut there, and the bacteria that produce all these beneficial branched chain amino acids.
Yeah, that's the funny thing in Monsanto's marketing is that it doesn't affect human cells, and yet we are primarily bacteria, and it short circuits their shikimate pathway.
Yeah, well, it's not Monsanto anymore. Of course, Bayer bought them up, and I was partially responsible for that because I catalyzed a campaign in 2012 in California, Prop 37, I think it was called, that essentially was the beginning of the end for Monsanto, that they were actually bought up by Bayer in Germany. So that's good, but they're still selling their toxic product, but hopefully we can eliminate that at some point. So anyway, getting back to the final piece of the glucose. So if you take dextrose, because they don't sell it as glucose, it's called dextrose in the store or online. It's hard to find in the store sometimes, but you can make, depending on how sick the person is, but you can put a pound of sugar, dextrose, in a half a gallon of water, and don't drink it all at once. That will metabolically crush you. It'll destroy you. But if you sip it, very similar to the way you're getting an IV, sip it all day long. I mean, so you're half a gallon of water over 12 hours. You're not going to have a insulin spike from that. You probably shouldn't. And yet that when that sugar goes in your GI system, it will never go down to the colon. It's absorbed in the upper and small intestine. So you get the benefit. You get the sugar going into your bloodstream and you get no endotoxin release. Now, is that a great idea for the rest of your life? Heck no, because there's no micronutrients. It's not a whole food. You do need whole and processed foods, but you have to get there some way. And this is like and it's $5 a pound. Where are you going to find $5 of carbohydrate a pound? You just can't find it. You're not. So it's like inexpensive as can be, doesn't taste bad, and it's easy. The compliance and everything pretty good. So that's my fundamental thesis for the sugar cure, because it allows you to restore your microbiome slowly, inexpensively, and safely.
What I will argue here, I'm just going to put something in between.
Yeah. This is why I shared it.
I'm just going to put something in between the low carb diet or carnivore like diet.
Yeah.
And getting to that point, what I've seen, and maybe because I see some of I really see the most complex cases, the ones that have failed every other doctor. And so even just with the dietary change, you don't always correct the dysbiosis or the imbalance in the gut microbiome. Mm-hmm. So, and a lot of times what I find has been missed because a lot of patients that I see have suspected SIBO, let's say, small intestinal
Yeah.
bacterial
That's
overgrowth.
really bad. Really bad. Yeah.
The what I find that Western doctors miss is that a lot of times behind that SIBO is SIFO, small intestinal fungal overgrowth, and they just keep treating the SIBO with antibiotics,
Yeah.
rifaximin. And what I've learned is that even though they say that rifaximin, for example, for SIBO is both an antimicrobial and a prebiotic, in some way it boosts bifidobacteria in the large intestine. What I learned from working with a lot of patients who have been on rounds of that antibiotic is that it triggers yeast overgrowth.
Yeah.
So now the
Yeah. It's
person
a problem.
has two problems. And if you don't deal with that, and I find a lot of times the only way to resolve it is to come in with some combination of antimicrobials, whether it's prescription
I agree.
antifungals, herbal antifungals,
I
get
agree.
that part of the gut into balance, and then you can move on to the next phase.
I agree. That's an unusual one. Usually we're an expert like yourself. And I am no stranger to that. And that's how I was really my pathway into this area, into natural medicine, was through William Crook's book, which we probably covered in the back. It was
Yeah,
called The Yeast Connection.
yeah.
And I had a chance to connect with William when he was still alive and was at a few events with him. And it was a real catalyst for my journey, and I understood it really well. Actually, when I first tried to apply his techniques when I graduated in '85 or when I finished my residency, the uh, the it was a miserable failure because I used the drugs and I didn't use this approach. But anyway, SIBO is not that common. But when it is, you cannot use the method I just said. And the method I just said is not for everyone. It's for the really severe non-SIBO patients for sure. Then we have to see someone like you because you got it. You're right. You got to take care of that fungal overload. Otherwise, it will not work.
Yeah,
And
exactly.
but that's really uncommon. It's not, but you're in bad shape. And usually those people have this massive food allergies. They can't hardly eat anything. It's just a really terrible place to be in until you can get over that
I
hump.
also I
But
also want to
so
mention an
yeah,
extreme form, because you were talking about like how do you make those colonocytes healthy again? And
yes,
let's take a case of ulcerative colitis, like extreme, like
yes,
breakdown of the gut barrier. They've got ulcerations. I've seen patients with calprotectin, which is an inflammatory signal released by neutrophils, right, in the intestine, in the 8,000 range.
okay,
Severe ulcerative colitis. And part of the strategy that I use is that I just assume that they don't have butyrate producers. Sometimes we
mhm,
can check butyrate in the stool,
yeah,
PCR, and so I'll give them oral butyrate, but I'll also give them butyrate enemas as well. And
yeah.
and I find that by doing that, I can drop their calprotectin pretty dramatically, and a lot of times even
That's
get them off
interesting.
of the medications.
That's really good. It's really clever. I think there's a better way to do that. Actually, I've just submitted a patent to develop the best microencapsulation process ever invented in human history, and it's very broad. I just submitted it a week or two ago, actually about 2 weeks ago. And the reason I'm not bragging about it, I'm just saying that there's a system that you can use with liposomes and polysaccharides to encase that butyrate
Mhm.
so that it actually, because you're taking it orally, and the problem is it's going to be diffused all over. You want to get it to the colonocytes. That's the
Exactly.
challenge. So if you don't, if it diffuses out in the small intestines, it's
You
worthless.
need
It's
a you
absolutely
need a
worthless.
delayed release.
Yeah, so this is the ultimate delay release. I can delay release that from anywhere to 4, 6, 8 hours. That technology doesn't really exist. So this will be able to do it, and it's microscopic. Microscopic. In other words, we're doing this as the reason this was invented initially, but it's going to be used therapeutically for other agents like butyrate, is that we can get those obligate anaerobes down into the colon
Mm.
intact, alive, which no one else can do because there's no system yet designed to get those bacteria alive. Because there's some obligate anaerobes like Akkermansia that are available now, but no one has a delivery system to get it there. But the other thing too is the best thing is, I mean, is to get why do you, as you mentioned, these obligate anaerobes like Akkermansia and the Clostridias and many other species, they right there, they're feeding that they're like spoon feeding those colonocytes right at that place. It's not diffused anywhere else. If you do a rectal enema, it's still the rectum is not that far up. So ideally you want to coat that entire large intestine with butyrate, and that's hard to do orally or rectally. So it does work, as you've shared with your experience. But I think more ideally, the best is to do it through the bacteria.
Yeah.
But then you could, but if that's not possible because you can't put the bacteria in, they can't grow
And
if you're
also
sick.
rebuilding the mucus layer, like
Yeah.
working on ways that you can help rebuild that.
So what's your favorite strategy for that? Because ultimately that's the goblet cells and the colonocytes do that.
Mhm.
Yeah. So, but
One,
what I'm sure it sounds like you have some strategies. So what do you
I
do?
have some strategies that are based on research. There's been research on how pomegranate extract can help
Oh,
rebuild the
okay.
mucus layer, and it's a really great pomegranate extract and citrus bioflavonoids. They act as polyphenol prebiotics,
Yeah.
but they don't cause gas and bloating like a lot of the other prebiotics, the
Yeah. Yeah.
oligosaccharides. So in a patient that comes in and they're severely bloated, and you want to, and you know that their mucus layer is destroyed, right? They've got leaky gut, they have dysbiosis. And by the way, you mentioned microplastics, and one
Yes.
thing that we know that microplastics do, and this is in studies done on zebrafish as well as mice, is that they disrupt the gut microbiome, so they cause dysbiosis, and they lead to disruptions in the mucus layer. So yet another thing to throw in the picture of what's harming our guts. Because I
Yeah.
had a patient with ulcerative colitis, and he's like, "Well, how did I get this? Like, I don't have this in my family." And I started thinking about it. I'm like, well, what are your daily habits? Do you drink water out of plastic water bottles? Are you picking up a coffee to go from a coffee shop every day? It's the micro habits that we don't think about, where we're getting exposed to these microplastics, but not to mention that now there's microplastics in fish.
Yeah, well, I think the biggest reason for the damage it's basically it's a synthetic estrogen receptor
Yeah.
activator, and just like estrogen, it causes massive disruption. It's very similar to linoleic acid. The mechanism is almost identical. So they're massive mitochondrial poisons
So I'm
ultimately.
going to
But
guess
I
that
think
you are,
what the
I got to ask you this. Well, I have actually now I have two questions for you.
oh
Uh,
great,
Well, one, just going back to the dextrose idea. So
yeah,
you're
and that's for go ahead.
you're proposing that as it sounds like also like a bridge,
It's a bridge. It's
right?
all it is, and it's really for sick people, not sick enough that they have SIBO, but sick enough that they can't have almost any carbohydrate. And you've seen those people all day long.
Yeah.
So this is a solution. Otherwise, the better carbohydrates would be whole foods, like, well, I wouldn't use fruit juice, but whole fruits would be good, or even fruit juice with pulp. That would be another, or white rice, which I'm sure you love. You know the dangers of brown rice.
Yeah.
So those
Yeah, I'm a
those are
big fan
healthier
of white
foods.
rice.
Yeah, and most people, if you can tolerate white rice, that is your carb of choice. And if you then the next better would be whole fruit, as much as you can get. And like the pomegranates
Look,
are good. I think that's
I'm Cuban, and you can see I'm pretty slim,
yeah,
and
yeah,
I eat a lot of white rice, and it doesn't make
yeah.
me gain weight.
I have 700 grams of white rice a day. 700 grams. That's a lot. So it's one of my primary carbs for sure. So I think that if you can tolerate it, it's probably your best carb. If the dextrose is just like a curiosity. It's like a paradox. Why should sugar cure you? But that's the reason why. And it's not for
So you're
everyone.
proposing the
It's not for everyone.
dextrose helps to repair mitochondria.
Well, only by giving only in the context where people are unable to tolerate foods
Yeah.
like fruit
which
or white
which I have
rice.
had those patients where
Yeah.
they're in that recovery phase
Yeah.
where they just can't tolerate the minute they have too
Yes.
refined of a carbohydrate, they're set back to all the old
Right.
symptoms.
Yeah, and this is where I would love for you to try this because I think you'd be very pleasantly surprised. I think it's not the SIBO patients. You got to take care of them like you're doing,
Yeah.
and then once they got over their SIBO, then you can try it for sure.
Yeah,
All
definitely.
right, so you had another question?
Now I got all distracted with
Okay.
the dextrose
Okay.
question.
Okay.
I know I had
Okay.
another
Well, the
question
pomegranate you
here.
mentioned, I think that's I tend to forget the specific names. It's allogalactin that's converted by your gut bacteria. It's a pretty significant polysaccharide, but that's what does the magic. It's not the because if you don't have the gut bacteria, it tends not to work well.
Mhm.
The bacteria converted over to that. But pomegranate seeds or extract
Yeah,
or
pomegranate extracts, citrus bioflavonoids. There are
yeah,
studies showing that they help rebuild the mucus polysaccharide layer, and they also help support akkermansia. So kind of
yeah.
backwards, like the idea that you're
Well, but
taking.
here you have to be careful. There's a lot of studies that show that. But what is the population they're checking? If they're doing it in someone who has SIBO, I don't think so. And it probably is not going to work. So you have to have a level of health in your gut for that to work.
Mm,
And so that may be a later thing down the road because yeah, if you look at all the recommendations to grow akkermansia, for most people it'll make you worse because their guts are not healthy enough to tolerate those recommendations at all. And I'm sure you see that all day long.
yeah,
Yeah, they just this should be healthy, but it doesn't work. Makes you worse. And
that is
that's the
the
paradox.
challenge with the types of cases that I get because they think they're being healthy,
Right.
and yet it's not working for them.
Yeah, and there's a reason for it. I believe it's the reason I just revealed in our discussion. And if you understand the biology of it, you can work around and you can circumvent that and to get them to health to the point where all those things are supposed to be healthy will be healthy because their guts were restored.
Exactly.
Yeah. Wow, this has been great. You're the conversation I want to have with all this time. And normally I get people to say, yeah, that's interesting, but they don't have the depth of knowledge and clinical expertise that you have to understand, appreciate, and dialogue about it. Because I think it is not easy. There's a lot of complexities. I mean, the specifics, there's a lot of little building blocks of puzzles you have to put together to figure it all out. Because if you only have one piece here or there, it doesn't make sense.
It
Yeah.
doesn't, and I think that's what I love about the work that I do as a functional medicine practitioner, but particularly focus on gut health, is that to me, when a new patient comes in to see me, it's like a puzzle,
Hmm.
but the puzzle is missing pieces. And as they tell me their story, I'm finding the pieces. And sometimes people don't realize that there's a little detail that they don't think is important,
Hmm.
but is actually a very key missing part of the puzzle. And to me, it's like playing a brain game. Like I'm figuring out the puzzle pieces. Some of that is from data, like using stool PCR testing. But we have to realize that none of the testing is at the place where you can just look at the testing by itself and ignore the patient. You can never do that. You've got to integrate the results of the test with what the person is telling you with your own experience. I have 25 years of being a doctor, not as long as you, Dr. Mercola.
Well,
But
but you probably seen more. My clinical experience stopped about 20 years. Then I
um,
stopped seeing patients. So I just teach through the website and such, but
which
and write books. But
with
no, I don't
incredible
see it.
information.
Yeah. But I'm actually coming up with a test. I'm actually innovating the entire laboratory testing industry. But the one that you'll be interested in, we hope to release fairly soon, maybe by year's end. We have to get the FDA approval and such first, but and certification, we're in the process right now. But it's essentially microbiome testing. I know those tests exist, DNA sequencing and such, but we've got to. Most of those tests, as you know, are hundreds of dollars, maybe 500 to 1,000.
Yeah.
And would that be fair in your experience? I mean, okay.
Yeah,
So,
they range
would
in like the $500 to $1,000 range.
yeah, what
Yeah.
about a test that would give you the top 20 obligate anaerobes and not I don't care what the pathogens are, right? Because you're sick. I don't care. Well, you want to see the quality of the good guys, right? How many are there? And how many? And which ones? Because many of the times they're absent. So I'm going to push the test as 20, and we're hoping to release it for $50.
Oh, wow.
$50. Yeah. That's crazy good. So
That's
that you'll have a simple test that you can give anybody is a screen. It's very similar to, maybe in some ways, it might be a better screen than the colorectal screens that we're using now. They have, the guaiac test, the soil guaiacs. Well, there's some controversy whether those are ever useful, but if you can, clearly, I think colon cancer is all related to the gut flora. And
Mhm.
if you can optimize your gut flora, you don't have an issue. So if you can have this test as a screen, so well, what are your good guys? Where are they? How much, what's the quality of them? So that's our goal. We are
Well,
we just
every cancer is related to an immune dysfunction, right?
yeah.
And we know, as you started at the very beginning, stating that the gut is central to our health. It's command central for the immune system, and the immune system is being controlled and regulated by those non-pathogenic bacteria, those good bacteria that live in the gut. They're basically coding and programming our immune system so that it acts appropriately but doesn't overact.
Yeah, ultimately, yeah, I, I think there's just no question the gut are involved. I think there may be collaborators. I think the primary cause of cancer is mitochondrial dysfunction. When you kill the mitochondria, you cannot produce energy. You have to have cellular energy to get everything working. I mean,
For the
because
cells to
if you
be
don't,
healthy.
yeah, you can't have healthy cells. And actually, most cancer cells have damaged mitochondria. That's been shown. In fact, there's some really elegant studies that you can put mitochondria from a non-cancerous person into a cancer person, though that's those cells, and at least in cell culture, will improve. And the converse is just as true. You can put the damaged mitochondria into a healthy one, and they'll start to get cancer. So it really is the core. If you can optimize the mitochondria, that you work. And part of that process absolutely is essential with the gut because you cannot be healthy without you because that everything starts going downhill. And endotoxins is probably, well, the most pervasive. So I think maybe the most pernicious, and we didn't even talk about this, is linoleic acid, because I don't know how aggressively you go to exclude that from them. But I think, in my view, the very first step that we do is get the vegetables out. It's
Mm.
step one. Step one. I don't know if you agree or disagree with it, but that's the first thing. And then get them off the drugs, like the PPIs and other things, statins. Things that.
I will say that I have seen over the years, in my experience, many supposedly healthy vegans who are super unhealthy. Their hormones are off, their gut is off, they're they feel horrible, and they're eating a diet that's super rich in omega sixes, seeds. You know,
Yeah, the healthy seeds and nuts.
yeah,
So seasoned
that's
nuts, they're certainly better than vegetable oils. But if you've been exposed to processed foods, which almost everyone, we talked about our early history, what everyone watching this probably ate like that, or maybe a few handful didn't, but almost
yeah,
everyone did. So as a result, all your fat tissue, unless you've gone focus on it, is loaded with this stuff. So if you're loaded with it and you add extra LA from seasoned nuts, you're off to the races. It's not going to help you. There's
yeah.
no way it'll help you. Now, if you don't have any of that, then seasoned nuts are okay in limited quantities. They're not intrinsically dangerous. They're dangerous in the context of elevated LA, excessive LA.
Yeah,
Yeah,
exactly.
yeah. But and that's what happens. So you agree, getting people off LA is the first step.
I think that's an important part of the equation,
Yeah,
and really optimizing omega 3s.
yeah, yeah. That's a bit, I'm not going to go down that whole rabbit hole because there's some controversy on that, at least in the Ray-P community, that omega 3s could be every bit as bad. In many cases, it is without any doubt because of the way that they're administered through fish oils and the processing of fish oils, and it's not being in the it's a triglyceride ester rather than it's an ethyl ester rather, I think, and instead of the phospholipid it's supposed to be. So it's damaged and it's a problem. So it's not. You have to be really careful with omega 3. Is what you have to. And ideally, you get it from food. Like healthy food that's not contaminated, healthy seafood that's not contaminated would be, but most people don't get it from that. They take a supplement and you have to be really, really careful. There are some good supplements out there. They're decent, but most, as you know, are not. I
Yeah,
would say the vast majority, maybe even over 90%, you got to be really careful of. So I would be
yeah.
really cautious with
Don't
omega 3.
save money on an omega 3. Like don't
Yeah.
buy a store brand omega 3, which is very
Yeah.
likely contaminated with PCBs and heavy metals.
Well, even if they weren't, it's going to be oxidized.
Yeah.
And if it's not, it's going to probably be in the wrong form, the one that doesn't work as well, the triglyceride form. So, any other pearls that you've acquired through your 25 years of clinical focus on the microbiome?
Over the years working with patients, we've talked a lot about diet and the importance of supplements, targeted supplementation, like knowing what to take, what not to take. But one thing that I've learned is that going back to how I got into being a doctor and learning about breath work and meditation, that at least with my severe gut patients, if I can't get them to shift more into a parasympathetic, relaxed state, their gut is not going to heal. Their bodies are not going to heal. It's so important to address the stress component, to address even in a person who doesn't feel stress mentally, their bodies might be having a stress reaction. So to change that and teach them breath work, meditation, whatever it is, whatever avenue into that to help them learn how to create more relaxation in their bodies is, I think, just as important as the diet and nutrition and knowing what supplements to take, because you cannot heal a stressed out body.
Yeah, and there's probably uh, some connection between the gut causing that to begin with. So when your gut is not optimized, you're going to have more stress
Oh,
just
and you're
because of the
gonna you're
interactions
gonna
that
have
occur.
more mental health issues.
Yes.
Like I had a friend who is bipolar and is on medications, but still had swings up and down like that. And,
Yeah.
not that my program is any better than other programs. There are many programs out there. But she connected with my last book, The Gut Smart Protocol, started following the program, really changed her diet, and she stopped having those wide swings. And actually, her medications became much more stable. Her mental health became stable just by working on the gut.
Yeah, that's exactly what you'd expect. So so you don't, I mean, sometimes even the meditations can be an issue. I've got another book coming out next year, early next year. I've written, it's called Power of Choice, which addresses this. And the traditional meditation isn't necessarily all that it's cracked up to be. In fact, it would make you worse because you're trying all so hard to get to the state, that may take
I,
20, 30, 40 years to
I
do.
think that breath work is, to me, is the entry point. And for
Yeah.
people who are turned off by meditation, I think if you can get them to breathe and to learn to breathe with their diaphragm, you
Yeah.
can transform a lot. And don't call it meditation. Just say, look, I just want you to breathe. I want you
Yeah.
to take deep breaths for 5 minutes,
You-
10 minutes, 15 minutes.
There are some challenges with deep breathing too. I believe in breath work, but it's sort of ironic that it might be counterintuitive that deep breathing could actually make you worse. And you can show this to yourself if you use a capnometer. You'll get hypercapnic. You'll actually lower your CO2 levels. And and it's actually the most common reason why people go to the emergency room in New York City, call up an ambulance, willing to literally risk medical bankruptcy because they feel so bad. I mean, if
Mhm.
you call up an ambulance and you don't have insurance, you could lose your house. I mean, it's so bad. Once you get an ambulance and you go into an ER, they can give you fifty
You,
thousand
def-
dollars,
you definitely
100,000.
don't want to overbreathe. And
Yeah,
the way I teach it is to make sure that the exhalation is twice as long as the inhalation. So, and
but you don't want to lose CO2.
ideally you're doing breath holding at the end of the
Yes, yes.
inhalation and at the end of the expiration. That's a little bit more advanced, but that's where you want to get.
Yeah, but you try instead of deep breathing, I always substitute for shallow, slow breathing. In other words, you're allowing your carbon dioxide level to build up, and you can easily measure this with a capnometer, and you can see that you can measure both. There's a lot of breath therapists who do this work, and you need the capnometers are cheap; they're a few $1,000s to measure it. But you get real data, and you can actually see. And the key is the CO2 to raise your CO2 levels, because once you start lowering it, the over breathing, that's what causes the problem that causes them to pick up
Well,
that
if you're
phone and
talking
call
about
the.
mitochondria, you get less oxygenation. It affects the hemoglobin oxygen release when your
Oh, sure.
CO2
Yeah.
levels drop. So, yeah, you want to develop some level of basically you're retraining your brain to tolerate a little bit higher carbon dioxide levels.
Yeah, and high CO2 does magic to your body. It's just it does the exact opposite. It releases the oxygen, and you saturate your tissues with more oxygen, and it obliterates panic attacks. That's why breathing in a bag works. Got to be the right bag. Can't be a plastic bag. You can kill yourself. And it can't be a big bag, otherwise you don't get enough CO2. Got to be that right lunch bag, the right small size. But you breathe into that, your CO2 levels go up, and your all your panic attack symptoms disappear. Just all you do is change CO2. It's magic. But one of the other things you can do with meditation, because meditation is valid. There's a concept called timeless play, where you're engaging in an activity. It could be anything. The opportunities are almost infinite. So, but it's anything that doesn't activate your five senses. Yet time disappears for you.
Mm.
It's like it could be 10 o'clock and it's like all of a sudden it's 11:30. You had no idea the time. That's meditation.
Yeah,
And you know, and the best teachers for meditation are kids under two or dogs. They are meditating all day long. They're the
yeah.
best meditation teachers for
I
sure.
totally agree with that. And finding, that's where hobbies come in. Or like when
Yes.
I was I was growing up, I played the piano,
Hmm.
and I
That could be meditation
remember
easily.
I remember
Easily.
playing. I was very passionate about the piano from the age of 7 to the age of 17. And I could sit at the piano and start playing and not stop for like an hour or 2 hours. And I know, thinking back, that my brain would enter into some sort of meditative state.
You 100%. Absolutely. Yeah. And that is the meditation that you need. That's the meditation. What
Yeah.
you experience when you're playing the piano. That's meditation. That's true meditation. The other stuff, not so much so. In fact, it's counterproductive
Hmm.
because you think you're trying to do something, you just get all that, and it just doesn't solve
You
anything, it
get
makes you worse.
frustrated with
Yeah.
yourself.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah. So if you,
that's why I think that, when I talk about breath work and meditation with patients, I try to adapt it to the person rather
Mhm.
than be dogmatic and say, well, this is what everybody should do. No, you've got to figure out what is right for the person. What is it that speaks to them? And honestly, I started meditating and doing breath work when I was 20 years old, and now I'm 51. And over the years, the style of breath work, the style of meditation, the way I do it, what I want to do has shifted and changed, because I'm always listening to what is it that my body
yes.
wants and desires, instead of, saying like, oh, I have to do transcendental meditation and that's the only way to meditate for the rest of your life.
Yeah.
That's no, because you got to listen to your body and listen to what is it that you want in that moment. Maybe you need to move. Maybe your meditation is taking a walk through the
Mhm.
park while
Yeah.
you're
Yeah.
while you're breathing, or doing
Yes.
some breath holds. It has
Or
to shift.
dancing while you're walking to the park. Just doing something where time disappears. Because I think the goal is when you're with your patients is to help them identify the equivalent of what you experienced when you were a child playing your piano. Whatever,
Yeah.
and there is no right or wrong. It's whatever works for them.
That's where pets can be really healing. I've
Yeah.
seen a dog, like buying a dog, drop a patient's blood pressure by 20 points,
Wow.
just by having a dog that just is loving and brings them that, like, we are community creatures. We're meant to be in connection with others. I think
Yeah.
that's also super important for oxytocin release, for wellness.
Yeah. Yeah. I've got two dogs, not one but two. They're Great Pyrenees. They're pretty big dogs, like 70 pounders, 80 pounds. And the one's a male, one's a female. And just watch them play is the most. I mean, you're almost meditating watching them play. I don't know if you've ever seen two dogs play, but they just bounce over, just roll and tumble and run. It's just they're 100% meditating. It's so much fun to watch them. Yeah. So, all right. Well, this has been great. I just love your approach. You're going to help a lot. You have to help a lot, but you're going to help a lot more. So, what are the resources that people can go to if they want to learn more about what you're doing? I mean, you got the gut. the gut protocol. No, the gut something protocol, right?
The
The gut health protocol.
Yeah, the gut care program.
Oh, gut care program.
People
Okay.
can learn more about me. Follow me on Instagram at Dr. Pedre. I put a lot of free content around gut health, and they can check me out at pedremd.com, PEDREMD.com, and learn more about my books and some of the other work that I've done. And my blog posts, I talked about microplastics and all those things at happygutlife.com.
Okay, good. Excellent. Wow, this is great. All right. Well, any other points you'd like to make before we sign off?
Geez, I feel like there's always so many points that could be made. Uh, I think we've really hit upon them. I'm just so honored to be here with you today and to have this brain swap with you, the brilliant Dr. Mercola. So I am so
Thank you for those kind
grateful
words.
to be here, and I know that we could probably talk for hours.
Oh yeah, yeah. Because I sense that we're both committed to we're not we don't stakes in the ground like I'm right, you're wrong. No, no. We just want to know what works. I don't care what it is, whatever works. We each have different experiences. And we can share with each other, and you learn. Like you helped me refine. I actually wrote about it in the book about SIBO because it I sometimes forget, and it's a really important point you made that if you have SIBO, it's a no start. You cannot use that. It's a very dangerous problem. They really need to see someone expert at you that can walk them through that. There, I mean, you're in deep weeds if you have SIBO because most physicians are clueless. I would say 95%. I would not, or maybe even more. They can make you worse than if you have SIBO when you treat them. It's not seen and you don't see a medical doctor. You got to see an expert medical doctor like you.
Well, they'll make you better for the time being, and then a few months later, month, 2, 3 months later, you become worse again, and you're confused as to what's going on. Usually it's because they've missed parts of the diagnosis.
Yeah.
Because the human body is complex. And what I like to tell people is that your body can have more than one story happening at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not like there's some magic bullet like, oh, we discovered you have SIBO. You just need this one thing and that's going to correct everything. No, because there's a lot of things. There's a domino effect that SIBO led to leaky gut, led to mitochondrial dysfunction, led to a whole bunch of other things. So you have to kind of be able to find all of the unturned stones is what I tell people, and then work on rebalancing the body. But it's still interesting because I had a patient recently who didn't quite understand when I told him all of the imbalances, and they wanted to basically have a diagnosis. And I told them, your diagnosis is all of these imbalances. And as we work on this, we're going to make you better. And they still, as much as I explained that they weren't getting it, that the body is a system and it's either in balance or out of balance. And the way you feel good is when you put everything back into balance.
This is so great. All right. Well, I am so glad we got together and had this dialogue. I've been wanting to dialogue with someone of your caliber for over a year, and I've not found him. I finally did. So I'm very grateful to connect with you because
Thank you.
it's so beautiful to have this knowledge. But when you share it, like I shared it with someone like a few weeks ago, and she was mostly focused on allergy. And what she said, she does a lot about the gut. And she said, I say her this, oh, that's interesting. It's like, what? That was the end of it. It's like, I wanted to engage with the conversation, just to go. So I thank you for giving me that opportunity to do that. And by doing that, people can understand the subtleties and the complexities and nuances of that and really integrate into what they're doing. So thank you for that. And I appreciate it.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks so much for watching. Remember, hit the like and subscribe button so you can get more videos that can help you and your family take control of your health.